Hi, Cosmic Soul family. Today, I'd like to invite you to look at Mercury Retrograde from a different perspective. Several times a year, Mercury appears to slow down and move backwards across our sky for about 3 weeks. Yet, astronomically, Mercury never really actually reverses its orbit around the Sun. What we call a retrograde is an apparent backward motion, an optical effect created by the changing relationship between the Earth and Mercury as they continue their journeys around the Sun. And I find that profoundly symbolic, because sometimes life feels as though it's moving backwards, especially during retrogrades. Old conversations return, old emotions resurface, old memories come knocking at the door. We may feel as though we've somehow lost our way, things aren't working out, our thoughts are scattered, when perhaps that's not what's happening at all. That nothing is actually moving backwards. Perhaps our perspective is changing. A change in perspective is exactly what allows us to see what has always been there. And this is why I've come to appreciate retrogrades so deeply, because rather than seeing them as something to fear, I see them as invitations. Invitations to pause, to reflect, and to listen, to revisit the places within ourselves that we've outgrown or perhaps never fully understood. Mercury in astrology governs the mind, and it governs language, communication, thought, perception, memory, the stories we tell ourselves, the stories we tell one another. And when Mercury retrograde moving through Cancer, our attention is naturally drawn towards emotional memory, family patterns, our sense of belonging, and the inherited stories that quietly shape our inner world. It's not to relive the past, but to develop a new relationship with it. And as I was sitting with this energy, another thought came into my consciousness. What if Mercury retrograde isn't asking us to find new words? What if it's asking us to become more conscious of the voice we've been living from? Because every story begins with words. And before we ever speak to another, we've already been speaking to ourselves. And as I continued to reflect on this Mercury retrograde, another pattern began to emerge in my consciousness, revealing itself. I found myself contemplating words, not simply the words we speak, but the words we've been living. It's an interesting symbolic observation that came to mind. If you place the letter S in front of the word, it becomes sword. So whether that's simply a poetic coincidence or something more symbolic really isn't the point. What captivated me was the imagery, because words have always carried the power to shape consciousness. A single sentence can inspire a nation. A single sentence can end a relationship. A single sentence spoken to a child can echo through an entire lifetime. Words don't merely describe reality, they participate in creating the reality we experience. Another familiar saying came into my awareness: the pen is mightier than the sword. Well, that's fascinating, because what is the pen? A pen is simply the instrument through which words become visible. Perhaps we've been interpreting that saying too literally. Maybe it was never comparing writing to violence. Maybe it was reminding us that consciousness, expressed through language, has always been more transformative than force. Empires have risen because of ideas. Wars have begun because of words. Peace has been restored because someone chooses different words. Healing has begun because someone finally said, "I forgive you." Or perhaps even more importantly, "I forgive myself." Language has always been one of humanity's greatest creative powers, which brings me back to Mercury, because Mercury governs language, communication, thought, interpretation, discernment, the stories we repeat until they become the architecture of our lives. And then I thought about the legend of King Arthur, because most of us remember the image of Arthur pulling the sword from the stone. But what if the sword itself was never the real treasure? What if the sword represents discernment, the ability to cut away illusion, to separate inherited stories from lived truth, to recognize the difference between what we've been told and what we've come to know through experience? Perhaps the stone symbolizes everything that has become fixed within us: old beliefs, old identities, inherited family narratives, the sentences that we have repeated for so long that they became solid, almost immovable. And yet, hidden within that stone, waiting patiently, is the sword, not as a weapon to conquer another, but as a symbol of awakened consciousness, the capacity to lovingly cut away what no longer belongs. And that's why King Arthur could lift it, not because he was stronger than everyone else, but because he had grown into the responsibility of carrying it. And that thought really anchored into me, because maybe Mercury retrograde isn't asking us to become more persuasive. Maybe it's asking us to gather more information. It's asking us something much simpler. Have we become worthy of our own words? Do the stories we tell ourselves reflect who we truly are? Or are we merely just being conditioned to believe who we are? Because every belief begins a sentence. Every identity begins a story. Every transformation begins the moment we choose a different story. Perhaps this retrograde isn't asking us to find new words. It's inviting us to become more conscious of the words already shaping our lives. And maybe the greatest sword we will ever learn to wield is the one forged through integrity, compassion, discernment, and love. And as I sit with all of this, another image quietly entered my consciousness through meditation, the image of the Caduceus, the ancient staff associated with Mercury. But unlike a sword, the Caduceus isn't an instrument of conquest. It's an emblem of communication, exchange, balance, and healing. Two serpents spiraling around a central staff. And for me, it's a beautiful symbol of dialogue, of opposites learning to move together. When I look at that image, I'm reminded of another symbolic tradition that speaks of two currents of energy moving alongside the central channel within the body. And whether we approach these images through mythology, astrology, contemplative practice, or simply as meaningful metaphors, they seem to point towards a similar invitation. Wholeness is rarely found by choosing one side over the other. It emerges when we learn to hold both sides. And perhaps Mercury, which rules Gemini, duality, the two, perhaps it's never been asking us to decide who is right. Perhaps Mercury has been inviting us into relationship, into conversation, into curiosity, into the willingness to listen as deeply as we speak. Because communication isn't only about sending a message, it's about allowing something new to be born in the space between perspectives. Earlier, we reflected on the symbolic image of placing an S before this word to create sword. And what if the central staff of the Caduceus represents that very sword? Not a blade of violence, but the steady axis of awareness, the place within us that remains centered while two currents move around it. When I look at the two serpents, I'm reminded of the symbolic imagery found in contemplative traditions that describe ascending and descending currents of energy moving alongside the central channel. And whether we see these as spiritual symbols, archetypes, or simply beautiful metaphors, they all seem to tell a similar story. Transformation doesn't happen by choosing one side over another. It happens when opposing forces learn to move in harmony around a stable center. Perhaps our words arise from that center. Our language carries the vibration of the consciousness from which it is spoken. The sword then isn't something we raise against another. It's the clarity of our own awareness. It's discernment anchored within the spine of our being. It's integrity. It's presence. It's the quiet courage to speak from the heart rather than from fear. And that's why Mercury's symbol isn't ultimately a sword at all. It's a messenger staff. Mercury reminds us that wisdom isn't measured by how sharply we cut. It's revealed by how consciously we can communicate. Mercury retrograde has a way of returning us to conversations that we thought we finished. Our old memories, old relationships, old emotions, old stories. They weren't returning to pull us backwards. They're returning because they're asking to be heard from a new level of conscious awareness. And isn't that what astrology invites us to do? Not to surrender our power to the planets, but become more conscious become more conscious participants in the rhythms that they symbolize. The sky doesn't command us. It mirrors us. It reflects seasons of growth, reflection, release, and renewal. Just as nature has its seasons, so does consciousness. This Mercury retrograde is less about correcting your communication with the world and more about restoring your relationship with the messenger within, that voice that quietly accompanies you your entire life, the one that has repeated inherited stories, and the one that is now ready to rewrite new ones. Because every transformation begins with awareness. Every new chapter begins with a different sentence, and every sentence begins with a choice. So as you move through this retrograde, I invite you to notice your words. Notice the ones you speak out loud. Notice the ones you whisper to yourself. Notice the stories you've inherited. And then gently ask yourself, is this still the story my soul wishes to live? May your words become thoughtful and your discernment become compassionate and your heart remain open enough to hear what life is trying to teach you. And may the messenger within always guide you back, not to who you were, but to who you've always quietly been all along. Thank you, Soul Fam. We got this. So much love.